fuels. This is already leading to stronger, longer, and more frequent extreme weather events. Climate change-induced disasters come with high human and economic impacts. More than 4 in 10 people in the world live in contexts highly vulnerable to climate change. Global hotspots are found in parts of Africa, Southern Asia, small island developing states, and Central and South America. In many of those countries, population growth, urbanization, and unsustainable development practices are boosting the exposure of people and ecosystems to climate change. But all countries are affected, as we have seen in Germany, United States, and Canada last year. It is essential to raise the ambition level of climate mitigation. That would also have a positive impact on air quality and is vital to tackle the looming water crisis and sea level rise. Climate mitigation offers also great business opportunities in many sectors like energy, transport, industry, and nutrition. Besides mitigation, it is more and more critical to pay attention to adaptation, since the negative trend in weather extremes will anyhow continue for the coming decades and sea level rise for centuries due to the record high concentration of carbon dioxide. One of the powerful ways to adapt is to invest in early warning services. But the basic weather and climate observing networks have severe gaps in Africa and island states. Only half of the 193 members of WMO have proper weather, climate, and hydrological services. This leads to higher human and economic losses. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary General Tallas, for these important remarks. I now invite Inge Andersen, the Executive Director of Unep, United Nations Environment Programme, to take the floor.
Thank you so much. And to you, Professor Hoo-Sung Lee, to you, Petri, my colleague, of course, to Abdallah Moqsid, Secretary of IPCC, and to the co-chairs, Dr. Deborah Roberts and Dr. Hans Otto Portner, and to the amazing and formidable IPCC scientific community and friends, greetings from Nairobi. We are in the midst of United Nations Environment Assembly, which gathers here to look at environmental issues. And this report comes at a time of great turmoil, when we need strong multilateralism to promote peace and healthy environment. And the message this report sends is clear. Climate change isn't lurking around the corner waiting to pounce. It's already upon us, raining down blows on billions of people. We're seeing dangerous disruption across the natural world. Species are migrating in search of more livable conditions. In climate risk hotspots, deaths from floods, droughts, or storms were 15 times higher than those in more resilient countries over the last decade. This is climate injustice, particularly for indigenous people and local communities. And all of this and more at only 1.1 degrees Celsius of global warming. Even if we limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the blows will come harder and faster. As things stand, we're heading to closer to 3 degrees Celsius. We are in an emergency heading for a disaster. We can't keep taking these hits and treating the wounds. Soon those wounds would be too deep, too catastrophic to heal. We need to soften and slow the blows by cutting greenhouse gas emissions, but we also need to cushion the blows by picking up our efforts to adapt to climate change, which have been too weak for too long. The best way to do this is to let nature do the job it spends millions of years perfecting, absorbing and channeling rainwater and surging waves, maintaining biodiversity and balance in the soils so that diverse plants can grow, providing cooling shade under leafy canopies. We need large-scale ecosystem restoration from ocean to mountaintop, including through agreeing to start negotiations on the Global Plastic Pollution Agreement here in Nairobi at the 5th United Nations Environment Assembly. We need to bring nature into baking hot cities to keep them cool. We need to conserve mangroves, coral reefs, and other nature's defenses. We need to protect and restore wetlands for nature and incorporate wetlands into our cities. Backing nature is the best way to adapt to and to slow climate change while providing jobs and boosting economies. We must start dedicating thought and funding to transformational adaptation programs with nature at their heart. Humanity has spent centuries treating nature like its worst enemy. The truth is that nature can be our savior, but only if we save it first. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Anderson, for these thoughtful remarks. We will now hear the presentation of the report's findings from the co-chairs of the Working Group 2, Dr. Deborah Roberts and Dr. Hans Otto Pörtner.
Thank you, Andre. It's indeed a great pleasure to welcome the global community to the start of a really important global conversation, where I and my fellow co-chair will present the outcomes of 5 years of hard work by the global scientific community. So welcome everyone around the world. Can we bring up the presentation, please? Firstly, thank you to everyone for joining us, and certainly as the co-chairs of Working Group 2, and on behalf of our authors, we are very proud to present this latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which focuses on climate change impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. 270 authors from 67 countries have worked tirelessly to produce this report. Over the last 5 years, they have assessed 34,000 scientific papers to prepare their findings. During the review process, they considered each one of 62,418 comments from experts and governments, which have helped make the report as comprehensive and clear as possible. We would like to thank everyone who has contributed to this process. Let us now share some of the key findings which reflect our growing scientific knowledge and provide the best understanding yet of climate change impacts, risks, options to adapt, and the limits we face. Perhaps this statement best summarizes our findings. The scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss the brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. This report offers solutions to the world. And in the next 20 minutes, we will explore these with you. But let's start with the impacts.
Sorry for this technical glitch. Let's start from the beginning. Global warming of 1.1 degrees Celsius has caused dangerous and widespread disruption in nature. The increased frequency, intensity, and duration of extreme events on land and in the ocean is driving mass mortalities, for example, in trees, as we show here in this drought-stressed forest in California, USA. And climate change is affecting the lives and livelihoods of billions of people. The impacts from human-induced intensification of tropical cyclones, sea level rise, and heavy rainfall have resulted in increased losses and damages. Impacts are magnified in cities, where more than half the world's population lives. Heat waves amplify urban heat islands and air pollution to affect people's health. Critical infrastructure, such as transport, water, sanitation, and energy systems, have been compromised by extreme events.
When multiple extreme events happen at the same time, they compound the overall risk and are more difficult to manage. What we see here is an example of how heat and drought combine to cause reduction in crop yields, made worse by reduced productivity because of heat stress amongst farm workers. Reduced yields lead to reductions in household incomes, increased food prices, locally and potentially globally. Climate risks do not respect national boundaries, and weather-related extremes are creating shocks to global trade. In the previous slide, we illustrated the powerful impacts of climate change on nature and people's lives. In this assessment, it is based on a new understanding of these interconnections. We can no longer think in silos, but have to look across climate, biodiversity, and human society and well-being if we want to tackle the many global challenges we face today. And talking of other challenges, climate change combines with unsustainable use of natural resources, habitat destruction, deforestation, and growing urbanization, as well as inequity and marginalization. These trends not only present threats to ecosystems and the people who rely on them, but also reduce the capacities of nature, communities, and individuals to adapt to climate change. 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live in global hotspots of high vulnerability to climate change. These are across large parts of Africa, as well as South Asia, Central and South America, small islands, and the Arctic. In these global hotspots, overlapping challenges include limited access to water, sanitation, and health services, high levels of climate-sensitive livelihoods, such as smallholder farmers and fishing communities, all increase vulnerability. High levels of poverty, weak leadership, lack of funding, lack of accountability, and trust in government also play a part.
Looking to the future, every small increase in warming will result in increased risks to nature and to people in every region of the world. Here we see a bleached coral colony on a dying reef off Okinawa, Japan. Let's consider some of these projected impacts on nature. This map gives an overview of biodiversity loss at different warming levels. We would see species extinctions and losses of entire ecosystems, such as mountaintops, tropical coral reefs, and coastal wetlands, even if we temporarily exceed 1.5 degrees warming for several decades. The risk of extinction in biodiversity hotspots increases by about tenfold as warming rises from 1.5 to 3 degrees Celsius. Nature services support all aspects of our lives, from pollination and tourism to health and climate regulation. Loss of ecosystems and their services has cascading and long-term impacts on people globally, especially for indigenous peoples and local communities who directly depend on them. Globally, population exposure due to heat waves will continue to increase with additional warming. At approximately 2 degrees Celsius, regions that are highly dependent on snowmelt could experience a 20% decline in water availability for agriculture beyond 2050. And we know that climate change will undermine food security. At 2 degrees warming, By 2050, people in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Central and South America, and on small islands are likely to experience food shortages, leading to malnutrition. About 1 billion people living in low-lying cities and other settlements on the coast are projected to be at risk from sea level rise and other climate hazards by mid-century. We provide a global perspective here, but this report also has an extensive regional focus. We have outlined the challenges we face and how they will increase at higher warming levels. The key question now is, how well are we adapting to changing climate? What we show is that action has increased, but progress is uneven, and we are not adapting fast enough. Growing public and political awareness of climate impacts and risks has resulted in at least 170 countries and many cities including adaptation in their climate policies and planning. However, there are increasing gaps between adaptation action taken and what's needed. These gaps are largest among lower income populations. At the current rate of planning and implementation, these adaptation gaps will continue to grow.
Let's now turn our attention to how we adapt. And in this report, we show that there are feasible, effective options we can take to reduce the risk to people and nature, but their effectiveness decreases with increasing warming. When we think of adaptation, our first thoughts must be around reducing flood risk or preventing water shortages. But what we show is that the strengthening of health systems can reduce the impacts of infectious diseases, heat stress, and other climate-related risks, as well as the trauma associated with extreme events. This is particularly effective if it's combined with other measures, such as disease surveillance, early warning systems, and improving access to potable water. Nature offers significant untapped potential, not only to reduce climate risks and deal with the causes of climate change, but also to improve people's lives and livelihoods. Agroforestry is a climate-resilient way of growing food and creating wildlife habitat. Here we see a Nigerian rubber farmer diversifying his business with food crops, fruit trees, and bees. Conservation, protection, and restoration can help natural forests to adapt. Planting a range of tree species, managing pests and diseases, and reducing wildfire risks can help build climate resilience in managed forests. In agriculture, irrigation can be effective, but it can also result in adverse outcomes, such as accelerated depletion of groundwater. This and other adaptation measures provide economic and ecological benefits, as well as reducing vulnerability. In urban areas and elsewhere, effective urban management can secure drinking water. Most action to date has occurred around water-related hazards, such as reducing the risks from floods and droughts. Letting nature take its course, such as restoring wetlands and rivers and creating no-build zones, can reduce flood risks. The effectiveness of most water-related adaptation declines with increasing warming.
Food security can be enhanced by making the food system more resilient. For example, through adopting stress-tolerant crops and livestock, agroforestry, and diversification on farms. Community-based adaptation that is locally driven, that respects local and indigenous knowledge systems, and is adequately resourced can also be effective. Strengthening biodiversity can improve pest control, pollination, carbon storage, and it can provide shade for temperature-sensitive crops such as coffee and cacao. This all brings a range of other benefits for nutrition, health and well-being, and livelihoods. By 2050, urban areas could be home to 2/3 of the world's population. Cities also offer opportunities to transform. Using nature and engineering approaches together is important. To manage flood risk, for example, it might be important to install floodproofing on buildings improve drainage along roads, and create space for water within the city, at the same time as constructing flood defenses. Establishing or restoring green and blue spaces, parks, green corridors, ponds and wetlands, as well as urban agriculture can all be woven into the built environment. Social safety nets for disaster management can help people overcome the impacts of climate change and can provide financial security. Additional benefits include public health improvements, especially from reducing heat stress and ecosystem conservation. In informal settlements, we show how local knowledge, adequate funding, skills and tools, as well as policymakers and residents working together can deliver adaptation at a city scale. Accountability, transparency, and commitment from government is also most important. Here we see community sanitation facilities being built and water tanks being installed in informal settlements in India.
We have evidence of maladaptation, adaptation that results in unintended consequences. For example, increased climate-related risks or increased greenhouse gas emissions. In this photograph on the left are sea defenses that may not be strong enough to protect the people living behind them. People can be lulled into a false sense of security. Compare this to an example from Delaware in the USA of how it's possible to use nature to provide flood protection. Indigenous peoples, ethnic minorities, and disadvantaged groups, for example, low-income households and those living in informal settlements, are some of the most affected by maladaptation. This reinforces and entrenches existing inequalities. We know that there are adaptation limits. Adaptation cannot prevent all losses and damages. And even with effective adaptation, limits will be reached with higher levels of warming. Some natural solutions will no longer work above 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. Above 1.5 degrees Celsius, a lack of fresh water could mean that people living on small islands and those dependent on glaciers and snowmelt can no longer adapt. And by 2 degrees Celsius, it may be especially challenging to farm multiple staple crops in many current growing areas, particularly in tropical regions. If we focus on financial constraints, we see that current global financial flows are insufficient, especially in developing countries. The overwhelming majority of global tracked climate finance was targeted at emission reductions, while a small portion went on adaptation. Climate impacts that result in higher levels of losses and damages also slow down economic growth and thus reduce the availability of financial resources.
To avoid mounting losses, urgent action is required to adapt to climate change. But that's not enough. At the same time, it is essential to make rapid, deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions to keep the maximum number of adaptation options open. So how do we accelerate and sustain adaptation? Political commitment and follow through across all levels of government is key. Greater adaptation is present where national climate laws and policies require adaptation action from lower levels of government and include guidelines on how to do this. Another area worth focusing on is institutional frameworks with clear goals and priorities that define responsibilities. These frameworks can impose duties upon governments to implement adaptation actions, for example, around conservation, sustainable use of beaches, urban development, and targeting diseases exacerbated by climate change. Enhancing knowledge of impacts, risks, and available adaptation options encourages actions from society and policymakers. Educational and information programs and the arts can play a part. Monitoring and evaluation is important to track progress because in a warming world, measures that are effective now might not work in 20 years. adaptation strategies might have to be revised constantly. Revisions should be fact and data driven. And finally, inclusive governance that prioritizes equity and justice is also important. Citizens, civil society organizations should participate directly in planning and decision-making. It's important to highlight that adaptation measures offer wider benefits. If we consider that 3.4 billion people living in rural areas, many of whom are highly vulnerable to climate change, resilience can be improved by providing social safety nets, improved roads, reliable energy, clean water, and improved food security. These measures not only build climate resilience, but they also go hand in hand with helping to lift people out of poverty and achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 1. These other simple examples demonstrate how different goals may be achieved in a variety of circumstances. In this report, we have looked at these synergies in some depth. And this is how we illustrate the multiple benefits of adaptation options. If you look at this figure, you see forest-based adaptation. It shows that it is a feasible adaptation option that will also help absorb and store carbon. So it has mitigation potential, and it helps achieve multiple sustainable development goals marked here with a plus. Likewise, if we look at options in our cities, we see that green infrastructure, green roofs, parks, and street trees play a part in helping us adapt. By providing shade and water management, they also absorb and store carbon. Again, they help with multiple UN goals. What we see here is the foundation for a solutions framework that is an important new concept in this report. Let's explore this now. If we look at this figure, we see a spectrum of futures, from a world with low resilience and high risk to one with high resilience and low risk. This high resilience, low risk future and world has reduced climate risks through adaptation, reduced greenhouse gas emissions through mitigation, and enhanced biodiversity. These measures together support sustainable development, for example, no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, and access to clean water and sanitation. This concept is climate resilient development.
Climate resilient development has to be considered across government and all of civil society. It should involve everyone, round the table, governments, citizens, communities, educational institutions, the media, investors, and businesses forming partnerships. Scientific, indigenous, and local knowledge and practical know-how come together to provide more relevant, effective options. Ecosystem stewardship is key. A healthy planet is fundamental to climate resilient development. Effective and equitable conservation of approximately 30 to 50% of land, freshwater systems, and oceans can help ensure a healthy planet. Involving traditionally marginalized groups, including women, young people, indigenous peoples, local communities, and ethnic minorities, improves the prospects for effective action. It is critical to prioritize equity and justice in decision-making and investment. Different interests, values, and worldviews can be reconciled if everyone works together. Scaled-up investment and international cooperation are also important. Starting today, every action, every choice, and every decision matters, because each of them can take us away from or towards a climate resilient, sustainable world. Worldwide action to achieve climate resilient and sustainable development is more urgent than previously assessed.
Climate resilient development is already challenging at current global warming levels. The prospects will be further limited if global warming exceeds 1.5 degrees Celsius, and may not be possible in some regions, including small islands, deserts, mountains, and polar regions, if warming exceeds 2 degrees Celsius. The science is clear. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. This report offers solutions to the world. This presentation has given you a snapshot of a wide range of topics that are covered in depth in this report. It's over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts and Dr. Partner, for your presentation. We will now turn to questions. Before we do that, just to note that in addition to the summary for policymakers, the technical summary, and full report, we also have several other resources, including a global to regional atlas. We have also extracted critical regional information into a series of fact sheets. All these materials are available on the IPCC website. To the questions now, and for the first one, I will be looking for brief comments from both co-chairs. It's from Seth Borenstein with the Associated Press. Can you address the sense of gloom and foreboding in the future painted here? How less livable a world do you see if major emission cuts and adaptations aren't made? And how big a problem do you see climate migration and climate-connected conflict in 2040 and in 2100? In 2100. Dr. Roberts.
Thank you so much for that question. I would rephrase that. I don't think the report gives a sense of gloom. What it does do, though, is it gives a very serious reality check about where we are, where we might go to, but also provides us with a sense that we can be agents for change. If we look at the challenges that we're currently facing, a lot of those can be addressed by creating a more equitable and sustainable world, by developing a new social compact with the planet that we live on, and by focusing our attention where we get most bang for the buck, protecting nature, as has been previously mentioned, but also using the opportunity to change the places where the majority of people live in our cities. So I think that's the important message to take forward: a difficult reality, but action is possible, and we need to do it now.
Dr. Portner? Your microphone.
Adding to this, thank you. Adding to this is an important aspect, that the choice should not be gloom and doom. The options are clear and the choices are clear. So the world has a limited time window available to move on the right track. And this understanding needs to evolve among policymakers and among society. And I think what this indicates, that we see currently an inertia in implementation, and that we currently see a large implementation gap, is that this comes together with an education gap and an information gap. So the collaboration of science and the media is important. But what is also important is to improve the understanding of these basic rules of how life best functions on our planet. And what is also important, that there are natural laws that we should not break, and that should not be broken in similar ways as we do not cross red traffic lights in our cities. So this is, I think, a point of orientation, and our report provides that orientation. By following these options, it gives us hope that a sustainable and climate resilient world can be achieved.
Thank you very much. The next question is for Dr. Roberts. The report paints a grim prospect for Africa and small islands, developing states. Are there alternative solutions for short and long term to alter direction from grim opportunities?
Thank you so much for that question. Indeed, as I said before, the report is a real reality check, and it's particularly a reality check for the developing areas of the globe. Africa is called out, the small island states, Asia, Central and South America. But there are also the prospects for dynamic change in those areas. If we see, for example, a change in financial flows around the world and investment in sustainable development in these areas, if we take bold action in terms of emission reduction, then much can be done to reduce the exposure and vulnerability of areas such as the small island states. Africa, particularly where I come from, has an enormous opportunity in terms of its very rich natural heritage to take that and use that as an increased adaptive capacity to deal with climate change, both its impacts, but also the impacts that it has across our economies, across our development options. So I think while these areas are threatened, there is no doubt that there is room for improvement, both in terms of global partnerships to foster sustainable development, but also to use the enormous natural resources of continents like Africa as a way to tackle the climate change challenge.
Thank you very much. Question for both co-chairs. If increasingly, this is from Thomson Reuters Foundation, if increasingly clear warnings about the existential risks of climate change are not driving anywhere near sufficient action, how do we drive that needed action? Perhaps first to Dr. Portner and then to Dr. Roberts. Quick comments, please. Thanks.
Well, I'm afraid to say that increasing climate change and the associated impacts and risks and their implementation are certainly an important motivation for the mobilization we need in society and in policy. We have seen that with the release of the 1.5 degrees Celsius report in 2018, which was bringing climate change close to the individual on this planet, and this has started a mobilization that I think still needs to continue and still needs to be strengthened. So calling out climate change as an ally in that mobilization is certainly not a good perspective. We would rather like to see the risks being reduced and those impacts being avoided. But climate change already gives us strong examples of what can happen if the climate system is brought out of the balance that it has had for the last 8,000 years during the time when human civilization was built. In that respect, making and bringing this close to the thinking of policymakers and also of society is, I think, an important task that will need to be fulfilled, and this in-depth understanding will mobilize the action and the resources that are needed for this task.
Perhaps just building on that response, I think what is powerful about our Working Group 2 report is that we speak to the very places that people live, work, and relax in. We've got a very strong regional focus. And I think that enables us to bring messaging that increases the agency of human society. You will see that in this report, particularly, we've got a very strong focus on the issue of human settlements, urban areas, rural settlements, and particularly in cities where the majority of people live. We speak directly to the challenges that cities are facing now, the impacts on infrastructure, the increase in the heat island effect, and the challenges that all of those pose to human health and economic development. But we also lay out the solutions that may be available to urban areas around the world to tackle those challenges. And I think it's by providing that very clear line of sight between where I live and the problems I face to the kind of solutions I may be involved in, empowers people to take action. And I think we see that more and more as the science becomes clearer and relates more and more to people's lives. People mobilize more. And so I'm still optimistic about the ability to mobilize extensively around this report and create the kind of societal response that we need to see.
Thank you very much.
Just to add to this once more, Andre, I'm sorry for interrupting you. Any short-term action and any compromise with respect to other sectors and compromises are an important part of the political thinking and action should have the long-term implications in mind. Should consider the orientation, for example, that our report provides in terms of what are the implications for the long-term future if things go wrong in the short term. And this emphasizes the thought about the closing window of opportunity. So any decisions to be made during this crucial decade in climate policy are important for our long-term fate and for the sustainability of life on this planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that response. The next question is for the Secretary General of the World Meteorological Organization. It is from Thomson Reuters Foundation. The question is, the report makes clear that soft limits to adaptation are being reached already, including due to a lack of finance despite the urgency. Can this report finally shift the needle in terms of spurring more adaptation finance to the vulnerable, and if so, how?
Thank you for that question. It's clear that we have to invest more in adaptation besides mitigation. Mitigation is, of course, essential, and we have to stop this negative trend in climate, and that's very urgent, as also this report echoes. But besides that, we have to start investing in adaptation, because the negative trend in climate will continue until 2060s, independent of our success in climate mitigation. And the Working Group 1 report, which was published last August, was demonstrating that the sea level rise and melting of the glaciers may continue for the coming hundreds of years. So that means that we have partly already lost the battle, and we have to pay more attention to how to mitigate the climate-related risks. And this has to be taken into account in various sectors in the society. It's going to affect food security, it's going to affect infrastructures, it's going to affect health, and it's going to hit also economies very hard. It was already demonstrated by the so-called Stern report 15 years ago that it's up to 20 times cheaper to mitigate climate change than to live with the consequences. And now we are already facing these consequences, and they will become stronger during the coming decades anyhow. And one powerful way to adapt to climate change is to invest in early warning services, which are in fairly poor shape in less developed countries. And we have also major gaps in the basic observing systems, especially in Africa, Caribbean and Pacific islands, which means that early warning services, the quality is poor there, and we don't know where to adapt to because we don't have the baseline. So we have to invest in both basic observing systems and early warning services, and take adaptation into account in many sectors, as this report is emphasizing.
Thank you very much for that response. The next question is for the chair of the Ipcc, Dr. Hwa-Sung Lee, as well as for Dr. Roberts. The question is, it's from South China Morning Post. The question is, the report mentioned Asia's risks and adaptation options to climate change. How do you assess China's resistance to the risks of water-related natural hazards, energy insecurity, and asset losses as mentioned in the report?
Ipcc is an intergovernmental panel on climate change issues, and we are not in the position of commenting on specifically our member governments' policies and programs. And if Deborah, Dr. Roberts wish to add, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. If we look at the information we provide on the area of Asia generally, we can see that we've already got millions of people in places like Asia, which are subject to acute food and water challenges in the present. So this is not a forward-looking issue. We have millions of people already affected by acute food and water shortages now in places like Asia. And if we think about a world of 2 degrees of global warming, then we know that under those conditions, even areas where we are capable of growing staple crops now will become unavailable for cultivation. And so we can see the rate of challenge is going to increase as every element of global warming increases the level of risk to which we are exposed, the range of impacts that we have to deal with. And so Asia, like many parts of the world, will have to deal with severe and current food and water crises going forward. And that's the importance of adaptation. We need to think about new ways of dealing with these problems. And our report talks to those solutions, new ways of cultivation, new crop types, thinking about how we conserve our water resources. And we know particularly Asia is critical because they have the water towers of the world in the mountains. And so thinking about those mountain ecosystems and the conservation of those ecosystems is important. But that scale of intervention is only possible if we've got governance that allows all levels of activity to be coordinated, if we've got adequate financial support, and civil society is brought to the table in order to participate in finding solutions.
Thank you very much for that. The next question, again, quick responses from both co-chairs. The Group 1 report said that we are going to reach, the question is from ARA newspapers in Barcelona. The Group 1 report said that we are going to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius no matter what before 2040. And in the better case scenario, we may reduce it after that. Then your predictions about extinction of species when we reach 1.5 degrees Celsius will be reached before 2040 for sure. What are the scenarios after that? Dr. Portner first and perhaps then Dr. Roberts.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Certainly we have considered overshoot scenarios in our report and have also considered their time duration, and they would last several decades until end of century before the temperature would be falling again. And during that time span, we expect the same level of impact as if we would have a stabilized level of increased warming at higher temperatures. It is fully in line with the statement that every bit of warming matters. So moving towards overshoot scenarios is not a safe haven that this strategy might promise. It will also lead to irreversible consequences. The melting of polar ice sheets will be increased, sea level rise will be increased, the loss of habitat and species with the potential for local extinction patterns will also increase. And there is an increasing risk associated with those higher temperatures of species losses entirely, as we have projected in the report that this increase is occurring in terms of the percent of species increasing with increasing degrees of warming. This excludes going for overshoot as a valid strategy in climate mitigation.
I think an important addition to that, and really the core DNA of the story we tell in the Working Group 2 report, is how closely human and natural systems are interconnected. And as Hans has pointed out, we have systems such as mountaintops, coral reefs, and others, coastal wetlands, which will be challenged in a scenario of overshoot. And this is critical because we're not only talking about the loss of ecosystems, but we're talking about the loss of ecosystems that are absolutely critical to underpinning the livelihoods, often of the most vulnerable in the world. And so this really raises the profile of the adaptation agenda, because we need to think about not only how we adapt to those changes in ecosystems, are there things we can do by increasing conservation areas, management, looking for a future, but what do we do with the human societies that are impacted by these changes? And again, this talks to the need to tie in our climate change response to a strong development response so that vulnerable communities have social safety nets. We put in place basic infrastructure. We think about realignment of financial resources. And so our report really speaks to this complex interrelationships of problems that we all need to get around the table to solve.
Thank you very much. Dr. Roberts, the next question is for you also. You mentioned cities being key sites for positive climate action. What are some of the most effective systems and strategies you have seen work practically on a citywide level, and what enhances their efficacy?
There's no doubt that cities offer us an important global scaled but time limited opportunity to act to increase our adaptive capacity. The majority of us already live in urban areas and cities, and certainly by the middle of the century, 2/3 of us will be living in urban areas. The opportunities in urban areas are multiple around planning and design of infrastructure, bringing nature back into the city. So often we've thought about nature as something that occurs outside city borders, but our report points out very clearly that if we bring nature back into the city, protect our floodplains, have trees along our streets, we can do a great deal to increase our adaptive capacity to deal with the impacts of floods, heat stress, improve health. And so there's a real advantage in reconceptualizing our cities, not only as a place of people, but a place of nature. We also need to know, though, that amongst our cities, there's a subset, the coastal cities, and we know that we will have about 1 billion people living in low-lying coastal areas by the middle of the century that are particularly at risk. And they're particularly at risk because of the impacts of sea level rise, salination, flooding, heavy rainfall. And those are areas we would probably need to act on initially, because they are areas of high economic activity, connectivity to inland areas, and because of the range of risks they're exposed to. And in those areas, we would need to think, for example, about coastal defenses, moving away from hard sea walls to more productive coastal ecosystems, early warning systems to enable people to know when risks are emerging and to make suitable plans, to factor in that we need good governance, and that if one wants decent responses to the challenges that many of these areas would face, we have to have everyone around the table agreeing on the plans, and this includes the most vulnerable. And the report is really important because it focuses us not only on the formal aspects of urban development, but calls out very strongly the informal settlements around the world where many of the most vulnerable live, and calls for a specific focus on these and a call to start investing in our informal settlements to change the tide, both literally and figuratively.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. Next one for Dr. Portner. This is from CNN. With everything going on, how would you like this report to be interpreted and prioritized by policymakers and the world at large? And what do you expect from journalists to help keep the momentum going in the coming months and years?
Thank you very much for this important question. The report talks about the impacts, the risks. It also talks about our possibilities to adapt and brings those solution options to the fore, talking also about the effectiveness and their feasibility. But most importantly, we also talk about maladaptation and we talk about adaptation limits. And these adaptation limits, together with the information about risk, provide orientation for the action of policymakers and also which future to go for. And this report strengthens the message around the agreement reached with the Paris Agreement, and it strengthens to move and push for the more ambitious side of it, with by casting light on the most vulnerable ecosystems on the planet, on the most vulnerable people on the planet, and also on the challenges that actually for some species and also for humans, we are starting to lose habitat in the most exposed areas of the planet, which are close to the equator. In the ocean, we are already seeing a development of a biodiversity valley, indicating and as a consequence of species moving towards the poles. There are also some areas on the planet that are represent environmental conditions where people can no longer be outside, and this is representing the same for our species as for others, a loss of habitat. So these trends will be strengthened with climate change. And I think continued communication between scientists and the media, as well as policymakers, is needed to bring such information to the fore, and as I said, to provide the information for ambitious action. And when I talk about action, I mean action along various lines that consider the interactions between nature, human society, and the climate system, and correct for the current imbalances that we see in these interactions due to the changing climate we are currently observing. In terms of motivating policymakers, I think it needs a mix of actions. As I said, in the short term, the information flow from science to policymakers and carried forward through the media, emphasized by the media, also the media reporting from the societal engagement and mobilization that is happening is key. But there is also urgency in developing the education systems, both the lower and higher education systems towards aspects and curricula that consider these existential challenges to humankind, which will be with us for decades and maybe even centuries to come, and educating the young and informing the adult population about these challenges will be key for ambitious global action. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that response. The next question is from La Repubblica for Dr. Roberts. Do you think individual change, that means change of way of life, is important at the same level of government and cooperation? Or people have to wait before a strong commitment at an institutional level first? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that important question, because it speaks to each one of us and the way we live our lives. And I think our report is very clear. It indicates that this has to be a whole of society response. So not a single individual, community, city, or government can opt out. We all need to opt in to the solution. And a key part of that is obviously the way we live our lives, the choices we make, about how we live those lives, but importantly, how we use our sense of agency in the world, how we engage with governance processes, how we engage with leadership in our communities, the kind of priorities we express about the kind of world we want to see, which will influence policies. So all of this is critical. The individual can play a vital role through the choices and actions they take and make in their lives. There are many things that individuals cannot change and that rely on governments at all levels, local, provincial, regional, national, international, to act. And we need that to be concerted. But again, governments by themselves can't act alone, and we must see the private sector coming to the table as well. And so it requires all of us to be playing our part in different ways, but ensuring that those actions are fully integrated. I think this is what has been very clearly made as a point in our report, is that while action is happening, it's not rapid enough and it's uneven. So various elements of society are acting, others aren't, and we're not acting fast enough. And so it's a really strong call for all of us to start doing the heavy lifting that's going to ensure a just, equitable world and ensure that we have a sustainable planet for many generations still to come.
Thank you very much for that response. The next question is from The Print in India. It's for both co-chairs, so I'll be looking for quick responses there. The report talks about maladaptation. How can countries prevent maladaptation in the long run while also addressing short-term needs? What factors must policy takers consider at the planning stage? Dr. Portner and then Dr. Roberts.
Yeah, thank you for this important question. And we saw examples of this on the slide as far as
maintenu en Ukraine, mais extrêmement réduit